We also got checkboxes and radio buttons. The difference being that for checkboxes, we can select as many as we want at the same time. For radio buttons, we can only select one at the same time if they share the same name attribute, which they do here. So we can add data properties for this as well, because it turns out we can use vModel here as well. So we got our interest checkboxes and then our how radio buttons. Hence, I'll add two new data properties here. Interest, and set this to null initially, and how, and set this to null initially. And how can we now use vModel for that? Well, we simply go to our inputs. Let's start with the checkboxes. And then on every input, we can add vModel. By the way, you don't always have to add it at the end. You can add it anywhere in this attribute list. And now simply reference the data property where this should be stored, in my case, interest. And we do this on every input here, on every checkbox, and the same for the radio buttons. Here it's how. That was the data property I added. So let's do that here on all the radio buttons. And with that added, let's see what's inside those values when we submit the form. So here I'll console log my checkboxes, and then thereafter console log this interest to see what's in there. And I will console log the radio buttons, and then console log this how to see what was in there. And I also want to reset that. So thereafter, I'll set this interest back to null and this how back to null. And we will see whether that works. If I save that, this is what we got. Now I'll select news, and oh, it's now always selecting everything here. So what's wrong here? Well, if you got multiple checkboxes with the same name as I do here, this automatically creates a group of those checkboxes. This is fine, but we need to handle it differently. In this case, we should create an empty array as a starting value here, and view will then add all the checked elements to this array. So we do this here, and we reset it to an empty array here. We now reload. We can check these individually. However, you'll notice that it still behaves strangely. If I, for example, uncheck one, then all get unchecked. Because we need to make one adjustment here. We need to add values to those checkboxes here. And these values need to differ, because otherwise View doesn't know which value to add to this array. So here I'll add a value of news, here a value of tutorials, and then here a value of nothing. And I'll reformat this to make it a bit easier to read. So these are my checkboxes, and I added this value attribute now, which is a default HTML attribute giving every checkbox a unique identifier, which is used behind the scenes. And I will already do the same here for the radio buttons. I'll also give those individual values. For example, the first one receives a value of video, next one receives blogs, and the last one here receives other. And then I'll save that. If we now reload this again, I can check them individually, and they now really work on their own. Also the radio buttons. And if we save this, we see for the radio buttons, video was selected. Thereafter it was cleared, because we reset everything, but that was what I did select before. And for the checkboxes, we get this proxy object, which in the end, under target, has the values I had checked. And just to double check this, let's pick nothing and tutorials here, and blogs on the radio buttons. If I save this, we see blogs for the radio buttons, and for the checkboxes, we see nothing and tutorial. So we got the keys here in an array then. And that's how we can extract values from checkboxes and radio buttons, also with vModel and with help of the value attribute. Now there's also one other case we could cover here. What if you had a single checkbox? And for that, I'll actually add a new div here with class form control right above the div with the submit button. And in there we can add an input of type checkbox, give it an ID of confirmed terms maybe, and a name of confirmed terms, because that's what I want to use it for. I'll add a label thereafter and say agree to terms of use and point at the confirm terms input with the for attribute. And now how can we get this value? This is now not a group of checkboxes, but a single checkbox for that given name. Well, we can of course also use vModel here. If I add a confirm prop here and set this to false initially, a confirm property, in my data object, we can bind this with vModel. So here on this input, which we just added, I'll add vModel and point at confirm. And now let's output this as well. I will console log confirm and then console log this.confirm here. So pointing at the data property we just added. And thereafter I'll set this confirm equal to false again. If we now save that and reload, here's our box. And if I check this and save data, you see we get true. And then since I set it to false, it's reset. So if you have a list, if you have a group of checkboxes which share the same name attribute value, then you get an array where all the checked values will be elements in. If you have a single checkbox for a given name value, then you get true or false. And that's now really all you need to know about checkboxes, vModel, and how to work with this in Vue.